There is an airplane sitting in a hangar in southern France right now that the mathematics said should not exist. Not because it was assembled incorrectly, not because the engineers made a mistake, because for decades, every serious aeronautical engineer who ran the numbers on flying nonstop from Sydney to London sat back in their chair, stared at the ceiling, and concluded that the physics were, at best, aggressively unkind. The ratio of fuel to payload to range simply did not work. The curve bent the wrong way. The numbers refused to cooperate, and yet the aircraft is there. Serial number MSN707. Rolls-Royce engines mounted. It is the first Airbus A350-1000ULR long-range variant delivered for commercial passenger service. In 2027, it will lift off from Sydney, cross 12 time zones, and set down in London without once touching the ground. 22 hours of continuous flight. No layover in Singapore, no refueling stop in the Gulf, no bleary-eyed connection through any of the world's interchangeable transit airports. One departure gate, one arrival gate. 10,573 miles of open atmosphere in between. Airline calls the program Project Sunrise, and the story of why that name means something and why the program nearly died before a single rivet was driven begins not in an engineering lab, but over the Indian Ocean in 1943. With a flying boat, a crew of exhausted men, and a sky full of stars they used instead of instruments. During the Second World War, when conventional routes had become operationally dangerous, the airline flew Catalina flying boats out of Perth across the Indian Ocean to what is now Sri Lanka. The route covered nearly 4,000 miles in each direction. Crews would depart in darkness, watch the sun rise over open water, watch it set, and watch it rise again before reaching land. The airline called these the double sunrise flights. They became institutional legend and imprinted something on the airline's identity that has never faded. The conviction that distance is not a ceiling. It is a problem to be engineered around. 80 years later, the airline publicly announced what it called Project Sunrise, a commitment to operate non-stop commercial passenger flights between Sydney and London and between Sydney and New York. At the time of the announcement, no commercial aircraft in regular service could physically fly either route. The Boeing 777 fell short. The standard Airbus A350-1000 fell short. Every aircraft in every fleet fell short. The airline issued a public engineering challenge to the two largest aircraft manufacturers on Earth. Solve this or lose the order. Boeing proposed a stretched 777X variant. Airbus came back with a deeply modified A350. The airline chose Airbus, and what followed was years of engineering work aimed at one of the most mathematically unforgiving constraints in all of commercial aviation. The core of the problem is an equation from the 1920s known as the Breguet range equation. It connects four variables: airspeed, aerodynamic efficiency expressed as lift-to-drag ratio, engine fuel consumption, and the ratio between the aircraft's weight at takeoff versus its weight at landing. That final variable is almost entirely driven by fuel mass. More range requires more fuel. More fuel increases takeoff weight. Greater weight requires more thrust. More thrust burns more fuel per hour. The system feeds back on itself. And here's the part that makes long-range aviation genuinely brutal. The relationship between fuel load and range is not linear. It follows a logarithmic curve. A 10% range extension may require 15 or 20% more fuel because the additional fuel itself adds weight, which demands more fuel to carry, which erodes the range benefit of every additional later loaded. Engineers call this the fuel weight paradox, and it becomes progressively more punishing past 16 hours. At the 22-hour mark, the curve has flattened to the point where enormous additional fuel quantities yield very little additional distance. You are fighting thermodynamics for every nautical mile. To overcome this, Airbus added an entirely new fuel tank to the A350-1000ULR configuration, mounted in the rear center section of the fuselage behind the passenger cabin. The tank holds approximately 20,000 additional liters, bringing total capacity to around 168,000 liters, equivalent to filling 2.5 Olympic swimming pools. Maximum takeoff weight climbed from 316 metric tons on the standard variant to 322 metric tons. The additional mass concentrated in the tail required a redesigned fuel management and center of gravity control system. Without active management, that concentration of fuel in the rear section would push the aircraft's balance point into an unstable range. European regulators reviewed the changes and determined they were substantial enough to require an entirely new type designation. The aircraft became the A350-1000ULR, a distinct certified variant with its own airworthiness documentation, not merely a range-extended version of an existing model. The fuel solution creates an immediate downstream problem that reshapes every other aspect of the operation. A commercial aircraft generates revenue through seats filled and tickets sold. When the airframe is carrying roughly 250 additional tons of fuel, that weight displaces payload. The standard A350-1000 carries over 350 passengers in mixed-class configurations. The ULR variant, to maintain the necessary fuel-to-payload balance for maximum range, carries 238. More than 100 revenue-generating seats removed from an aircraft that costs the same to buy, crew, and maintain. The fuel weight paradox does not just complicate the physics, it makes the underlying business model considerably harder, which means the seats that remain must generate far more revenue per passenger than on a conventional route. The cabin reflects this pressure. The 238 seats divide into 6 first-class private suites, with enclosed doors and 2-meter beds, 52 business-class suites with sliding privacy doors and flat beds, 40 premium economy seats, and 140 economy seats. More than 40% of the cabin, by count, is dedicated to premium revenue. Economy passengers receive 33 inches of pitch, more than most carriers offer, on routes a fraction of the length. The airline projects a revenue premium of 20 to 30% above equivalent one-stop itineraries. A single-stop economy fare from Sydney to London through a major hub typically runs between $800 and $1,500 Australian dollars in promotional windows. The nonstop product carries a meaningful premium, and the commercial case depends on enough passengers, particularly corporate and premium leisure travelers, concluding that direct routing is worth the price difference. For a business traveler whose employer covers the ticket, the logic is relatively clean. For a leisure traveler running the numbers personally, the calculation is less automatic. 12 aircraft were ordered. 12 units at a list price of approximately $360 million each. Each route requires roughly 3 aircraft to maintain daily frequency when maintenance cycles are factored in. Sydney to London and Sydney to New York together consume nearly the entire initial order before a single spare is held. If yields fall below projections, if jet fuel prices move adversely, or if premium travel demand softens in a downturn, the program faces serious financial pressure. The airline has noted these aircraft can be redeployed to other long routes in the network. That flexibility is real, but it is a contingency, not a plan. What neither the fuel equations nor the financial models fully captured was the second major obstacle that emerged during development. An airframe constructed of aluminium and carbon fiber is indifferent to 22 consecutive hours of flight. It does not develop fatigue from disrupted sleep cycles. Crew members, however, are a different system entirely. In 2019, the airline operated 3 research flights using Boeing 787 aircraft on routes approximating Project Sunrise distances. Around 40 people flew each sector, airline staff and academic researchers not paying passengers. Pilots operated with electroencephalogram sensors on their scalps, recording brain electrical activity throughout flights approaching 19 hours. Researchers from Australian universities monitored melatonin levels, reaction times, and cognitive function at intervals across the full duration of each flight. The data was instructive and, in specific respects, alarming. Pilot cognitive function during ultra-long flights does not degrade gradually and predictably. It drops in waves shaped by circadian timing, meal composition, workload changes, and individual variation. A crew member can report feeling alert while simultaneously showing measurable impairment on neurological monitoring. That gap between subjective experience and objective neurological state is precisely what creates risk. At the time, no aviation authority had fatigue management rules covering commercial flights of 22 hours. The research data from those flights became part of the foundation for entirely new regulatory requirements. The solution adopted requires 4 pilots on every service, rotating through defined rest periods, with dedicated crew rest compartments built into the aircraft structure. Not jump seats or curtained galleys, but purpose-built, isolated rest spaces engineered for genuine sleep during a flight covering more than a third of the Earth's circumference. The airline also invested in understanding what 22 hours does to passenger physiology. The A350's composite fuselage allows cabin pressurization to a 6,000-foot altitude equivalent rather than the 8,000-foot standard on older generation aluminum aircraft. Lower cabin altitude means higher blood oxygen, reduced dehydration, and less physiological fatigue on arrival. A dedicated wellness zone between premium economy and economy sections gives passengers space to stand and move, a first for any production commercial aircraft. The lighting system runs across 12 program scenes, including a dynamic sunrise sequence rolling from the front to the rear of the cabin, calibrated to shift passenger circadian alignment toward the destination before landing. Meal service follows destination time rather than departure time. Every scheduled event across the 22 hours has been sequenced around human neurochemistry rather than operational convenience. The detail that most precisely captures the character of this entire program is this. The wine carried on these flights was evaluated partly on bottle weight. Every kilogram removed from a commercial aircraft generates fuel savings that, accumulated over hundreds of annual flights, amount to thousands of dollars per kilogram per year. On a flight operating at the absolute certified upper boundary of its range, where every additional 100 kilograms of payload compresses the margin against maximum takeoff weight, a glass bottle of wine is not a hospitality decision. It is a weight engineering decision. The catering team and the airframe engineers were working the same constraint from opposite directions. MSN 707 rolled out of the Toulouse facility on the 12th of April, 2026. It will complete flight testing before late 2026 delivery and enter service in 2027. The airline will name each of the 12 aircraft after stars, a deliberate echo of the double sunrise crews who navigated wartime Indian Ocean crossings by celestial observation alone, without satellite navigation, without digital weather modeling, without a composite fuselage engineered for passenger physiology, charts, a sextant, and open ocean. The crews of 2027 will have everything a century of aviation development has produced. EEG informed rest schedules, circadian-tuned lighting, neurologically sequenced meals, and 168,000 liters of fuel loaded to the certified airframe limit. And they will still be doing something that aeronautical mathematics spent decades suggesting was not worth attempting. Because the Breguet range equation never said impossible, it said expensive. It said every nautical mile costs more than the one before it, that the curve flattens, that returns diminish, and that at some point you are spending a great deal for very little additional distance. What it could not calculate was whether passengers would pay what the physics demands, whether the business case survives at the outer limit of the range envelope, whether the revenue from 238 seats priced at a premium on 12 aircraft costing $360 million each can outlast a decade of fuel prices, economic cycles, and changing travel patterns. That is the question Project Sunrise is actually asking, not whether an aircraft can fly from Sydney to London without stopping. MSN 707 already answers that. The question is whether enough people for enough years at prices high enough to justify the investment will choose to sit inside it for 22 hours rather than spend less money and change planes in Singapore. In commercial aviation, the technical barrier and the financial barrier are never quite the same obstacle. Engineers cleared the first one. What happens above the Indian Ocean in 2027 will determine whether anyone can clear the second. If the physics of extreme aviation and the economics behind it interest you, there is more here. The next video is already queued.